Know your place. The words cut across the boardroom so sharply that even the air seemed to stop moving. 22 floors above Manhattan, inside the glass-walled executive suite of the St. James Hotel, every polished shoe, every silver pen, every expensive watch turned toward the woman holding a coffee tray. Grace Coleman stood beside the long walnut conference table in a pressed housekeeping uniform, one hand steady on the tray, the other resting at her side. She did not flinch. Around her, men in tailored suits and women with tablets froze mid-note, their eyes shifting between the white-haired CO who had spoken and the black maid he had just reduced to a position, a category, a place. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, posture straight, jaw calm, cufflinks gleaming under recessed lights. He had the kind of face built by years of being obeyed. Nothing about him rose above a polite volume, yet the room bent around his voice as if it were gravity. In front of him lay a merger agreement worth $400 million, pages marked with tabs, signatures waiting at the bottom. Across from him sat executives from Hanover Energy, lawyers from 2 firms, and 3 investors who controlled enough capital to move markets before lunch. Grace had entered 5 minutes earlier to refresh coffee, replace water, and disappear. That was how the morning was supposed to go. Quiet wheels on the service cart. Eyes lowered. Cups filled. Exit unnoticed. But then she had seen the number. Just a glance while setting down a fresh pot beside a binder left open near Richard's elbow. Most people would have seen only columns and decimals. Grace saw a mismatch. Appendix C listed environmental liabilities at $6.2 million. Schedule 4B listed reserve exposure at $24.4 million. Same site. Same quarter. Same acquisition target. 2 truths could not live on the same page. Sir, she had said softly, not interrupting, only slipping the word into a pause. That figure doesn't match the appendix. Heads turned with mild irritation. Richard looked up slowly, eyes moving from her face to the tray, then back again. There had been a moment, thin as paper, when he could have asked what she meant. Instead, he chose the sentence that now still hung in the room like smoke. Know your place. A junior associate coughed to hide a laugh. Someone near the windows smiled into a legal pad. Another executive pretended to keep typing, though her fingers had stopped. Grace felt the familiar heat rise behind her ribs, that old burn of being dismissed before being heard. She knew it from supermarkets, hospital desks, reception counters, elevators where purses were pulled closer, offices where people assumed she was there to clean but never to think. But humiliation had long ago lost its power to surprise her. What still surprised her was how often arrogance made smart people careless. She set a porcelain cup in front of an investor and answered in a tone so even it seemed almost gentle. Then someone in this room should know what's hidden on page 47. No one laughed this time. Richard's expression barely changed, but the hand resting on his Mont Blanc pen tightened. "Excuse me," he said. Grace met his eyes. Appendix C references a reserve transfer. Schedule 4B values the same liability 4 times higher. If the lower number is used in closing, whoever buys this company inherits the rest after signature. A chair creaked. One of Hanover's attorneys reached for the binder. Another flipped instantly to the tab marked C. Paper began turning faster now, crisp and nervous. Richard leaned back, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This is absurd. She's staff. The words landed weaker than he intended, because now nobody was looking at Grace's uniform. They were looking at page 47. Grace stood motionless beside the table while the room changed temperature around her. The investor nearest the door loosened his tie. A woman from compliance adjusted her glasses and scanned line by line. Someone whispered, "How did we miss that?" Richard's voice sharpened. "Security." But the command drifted unanswered. The guard outside the door had not moved, and neither had anyone else. Money had a language louder than status. Grace noticed the city beyond the glass. Rain beginning over the Hudson, gray sheets moving between towers. She always liked storms from high places. They made rich men remember the sky was bigger than their buildings. "This clause transfers post-close remediation," said the Hanover attorney, now standing. "Richard, did your team disclose this?" Richard's jaw flexed once. "It's standard structuring language." "No," Grace said quietly. "Standard language doesn't hide a landfill cleanup in a footnote." Every eye returned to her. She had not raised her voice. She had not moved an inch. Yet somehow she now stood at the center of a room built to exclude her. Richard rose slowly from his chair. The movement carried authority by habit, but less than before. "And where exactly?" he asked, each word polished and cold. "Did a hotel maid learn to interpret mergers and acquisitions?" Grace looked at the stack of contracts, then at the skyline beyond him, then back into the face of the man who had told her her place. "Same place you did," she said. "I just had to work nights while learning it." Silence fell harder than before. And on the far side of the table, the lead investor closed the binder, folded his hands, and said 3 words that changed everything. "Meeting is paused." The room did not empty all at once. It loosened slowly, like a knot refusing to admit it had been tied. Chairs scraped back in careful inches. Phones lit beneath the table. Lawyers carried binders into the hallway with faces trained to reveal nothing. Through the glass walls of the executive suite, midtown traffic moved far below in silver lines, unaware that $400 million had just begun to wobble. Grace Coleman stood beside the service cart with both hands folded over the handle, waiting for someone to tell her whether to stay or go. No one did. Richard Whitmore remained near the head of the table, speaking in a low voice to his chief counsel. He did not look at her. That almost amused her. Men like Richard could face risk, numbers, markets, even scandal. What unsettled them most was being wrong in front of witnesses. A hotel manager named Denise Mercer hurried in from the corridor, heels tapping sharply across the stone floor. Her smile was too quick, too polished. "Grace," she whispered, stopping inches away. "Come with me." Grace followed her through the side hallway used by catering staff and housekeeping. The noise of the boardroom dimmed behind closing doors. In the service corridor, the air smelled of coffee grounds, lemon cleaner, and warm linen. It was a scent Grace trusted more than imported cologne and polished oak. Denise turned the moment they were alone. "What were you thinking?" she hissed. "Those are private clients." Grace kept her voice level. "I was thinking someone should notice the numbers before they signed." Denise pinched the bridge of her nose. "Your job is not to notice." Grace said nothing. She had learned years ago that silence often forced other people to hear themselves. Denise straightened her blazer. "Wait in the staff lounge. Do not speak to anyone." The lounge was a narrow room behind the banquet kitchen with 2 vending machines, a humming refrigerator, and a clock that always ran 3 minutes fast. Grace sat beneath fluorescent lights and wrapped both hands around a paper cup of water she did not drink. Around her, cooks moved in and out, pretending not to stare. News traveled quickly in buildings like this. By now half the hotel knew a maid had stopped a merger upstairs. She could feel their curiosity sliding under the door. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Rain tapped softly against a high window near the ceiling. Grace watched droplets gather and race downward, merging with others on the way. Her mother used to say water always finds truth eventually. It moves around every obstacle until there is nowhere left for lies to stand. Grace smiled at the memory. Laverne Coleman had worked double shifts cleaning offices in Newark for 23 years. She wore sneakers with perfect white soles because, she said, dignity begins at the ground. When Grace was 14, her mother brought home discarded accounting textbooks from a law firm trash bin. "If they throw knowledge away," she said, setting them on the kitchen table, "we will keep it." Grace studied under buzzing apartment lights while trains rattled outside the window. Numbers made sense to her in a world that often did not. Debits had credits. Errors could be traced. Truth balanced if you were patient enough. She earned scholarships, graduated near the top of her class, and entered corporate audit before 30. Then came the stroke. Hospital corridors. Insurance appeals. Rehab centers that smelled like bleach and fear. Promotions passed. Savings vanished. Her mother needed full-time care, then part-time care, then memory care. Grace needed work that paid now, not later. The St. James Hotel offered immediate hours, health benefits after 90 days, and no interest in why someone with her resume was applying for housekeeping. They only asked if she could lift 30 pounds and work weekends. She said yes to both. The lounge door opened. A dishwasher stepped in, grinning wide. "Girl," he said, "they are tearing each other apart upstairs." Grace almost laughed. "Thank you for the update, Marcus." He leaned against the vending machine. They asked for every copy of the contract. One lawyer looked like he swallowed a battery. Before she could answer, Denise reappeared. Grace. Now. This time they did not go to the manager's office. They went back upstairs. The executive floor felt colder than before. The conference room doors were open, but the long table sat empty except for scattered folders and half-finished coffee cups. A city of abandoned decisions. Denise led her farther down the hall to a smaller room with dark wood walls and a single window facing the rain. Inside waited 3 people: the lead investor, a woman from Hanover Energy, and Richard Whitmore. Richard stood near the window with his back turned, hands clasped behind him. The investor motioned for Grace to sit. She remained standing. Ms. Coleman, he said, voice calm and expensive, we would like to ask a few questions. Of course. The Hanover executive slid a document across the table. How did you spot the discrepancy so quickly? Grace glanced at the page. Because whoever changed Schedule 4B forgot to update the reserve ratio in Appendix C. The percentages still point to the original number. The woman blinked once, then nodded slowly. That is correct. Richard finally turned from the window. His expression was composed again, but thinner. Now, as if confidence had been sanded down at the edges. And you expect us to believe you noticed that while serving coffee? Grace met his gaze without heat. No, sir. I expect you to believe math. The investor looked down to hide a smile. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. Richard took one step toward the table. Who hired you? He asked. Grace answered plainly. The hotel did. No, he said. Who sent you? The question hung in the room like a bad smell. Grace understood it instantly. Men like Richard rarely imagined a black woman could arrive carrying competence on her own. There always had to be a hidden hand, a conspiracy, another explanation safer than merit. She folded her hands. My mother sent me, she said. Every day she told me to be ready when ignorance opened a door. For the first time since morning, no one in the room had anything to say. The silence after Grace spoke did not feel empty. It felt expensive. Rain streaked the narrow window beside Richard Whitmore, turning the city beyond into blurred silver lines. Inside the private conference room, no one moved quickly anymore. Quick movements belonged to confidence. What remained now was caution. The lead investor, Charles Bennett, steepled his fingers and studied Grace the way seasoned men study markets after a sudden drop. Across from him, Dana Mercer of Hanover Energy flipped through pages already marked with yellow tabs. Richard stood at the end of the table, shoulders squared, expression carefully neutral. Only the pulse in his temple betrayed the strain. Ms. Coleman, Charles said at last, if you had not spoken this morning, when would this liability have surfaced? Grace answered without drama. Likely after closing. Once environmental claims were formally transferred and reserve adjustments were recalculated. Dana looked up sharply, meaning my board would have inherited the exposure. Yes, ma'am. Richard exhaled through his nose. This is becoming theatrical. His voice was controlled, but thinner than before. The numbers are subject to interpretation. Grace turned slightly toward him. Percentages are not interpretation, sir. They are math. Dana pressed, her lips together to hide a reaction. Charles did not hide his. He smiled once, small and quick, then returned to stillness. Richard, he said, did your team authorize revisions to Schedule 4B after last week's draft? Routine updates happen in every deal. That was not my question. The room tightened again. Richard walked to the table, placed both palms on polished wood, and leaned forward just enough to signal command. He had spent decades mastering posture as leverage. My company has built value for everyone in this room. We are discussing formatting changes elevated by a hotel employee with an opinion. Grace noticed he still would not say her name. Some people believe disrespect became truth if repeated enough times. Dana closed the binder softly. The sound landed harder than shouting. Formatting changes do not create $18 million in hidden cleanup costs. Richard straightened. Hanover wanted speed. Hanover wanted transparency. Her voice stayed calm, which made it sharper. Outside, thunder rolled farther away now, moving east across the river. Grace thought of storms again. They never asked permission before rearranging the sky. Charles shifted his attention back to her. You mentioned reserve ratios. Explain it simply. Grace stepped closer to the table, not as staff now, not as a guest, simply as the most useful person in the room. She pointed to 2 columns. This percentage ties projected liability to reported reserves. Here it reflects the original 24.4 million estimate. But this page lists 6.2 million. If the smaller number were genuine, the ratio would also change. It did not. Someone changed the headline figure and forgot the mechanics underneath. Dana let out a slow breath. That is exactly what our internal team missed. Richard laughed once, but there was no warmth in it. So now we are taking lessons from housekeeping. Grace did not answer. Charles did. Today, yes. Richard's face hardened by a degree so slight most people would miss it. Grace did not miss it. She had seen that look before in offices where men mistook hierarchy for intelligence. It was the moment resentment realized it. No longer controlled the room. Denise Mercer, the hotel manager, appeared quietly at the door with fresh coffee, then froze when she sensed the atmosphere. Charles waved her in. Leave the pot, thank you. Denise set it down carefully and glanced at Grace with wide eyes before slipping out again. Even she understood the balance of power had shifted. Dana gathered her papers into a neat stack. Hanover is suspending negotiations pending full forensic review. Richard turned to her. You do that, and this market window closes. Then it closes. You will regret walking away. I regret coming this close. Her words landed clean and cold. Charles rose next. My fund will not finance any transaction under present disclosures. 2 sentences. Hundreds of millions of dollars evaporated between them. Richard looked from one face to another as if searching for the version of the room he had entered that morning. It was gone. In its place stood consequence. He fixed his eyes on Grace. Do you enjoy this? He asked quietly. Watching people lose? Grace felt something old stir in her chest. Not anger, something steadier. She thought of her mother practicing signatures after physical therapy because the stroke had taken strength from her hand. She thought of unpaid bills, overnight shifts, and every time someone assumed dignity could be measured by a uniform. No, sir, she said. I enjoy when people stop others from losing. No one spoke after that. Richard looked away first. Charles reached into his jacket and removed a cream-colored card. He slid it across the table toward Grace. My firm needs analysts who can see what everyone else misses. Grace glanced at the card but did not touch it yet. Old habits taught caution. Opportunities sometimes arrive dressed like traps. Dana stood and extended her hand. For what it is worth, thank you. Grace shook it. Her palm was warm, firm, human. A simple thing, but after a morning of being treated like furniture, it mattered. Richard moved toward the window again, city light reflecting across the glass and cutting his silhouette into fragments. He spoke without turning. She violated confidentiality. Charles answered from the doorway. No, Richard. She violated your assumption. Then he left. Dana followed. Papers were gathered. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps faded down the hall. In less than 60 seconds, the room that had once been around Richard Whitmore was nearly empty. Grace remained beside the table, the investor's card still waiting between them. Richard finally faced her again. His voice had lost its polish. Who are you really? Grace picked up the card, slipped it into her pocket, and adjusted the cuff of her housekeeping sleeve. Someone who reads the fine print. Then she walked out, leaving him alone with the rain and the numbers he could no longer hide. Grace expected to be sent back to linen carts and hallway mirrors. Instead, the elevator carried her to the 31st floor. The ride was silent except for the soft hum of cables and the faint tap of rain against the shaft windows whenever the car passed an exterior section. She stood alone inside, one hand on the rail, housekeeping badge still clipped to her pocket, Charles Bennett's business card resting like a secret in her sleeve. When the doors opened, the carpet changed first. Thick, charcoal gray, soft enough to swallow footsteps. Then came the light. Warmer here, golden instead of white, designed to flatter expensive faces and difficult decisions. At the end of the corridor, Denise Mercer waited beside a frosted glass office marked Executive Operations. Her posture was stiff, but the sharpness from earlier had drained away. They want to speak with you, she said quietly. Grace studied her for a moment. Who is that? Denise glanced at the door. Ownership. She opened it. The office beyond was larger than Grace's apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the rain-washed skyline. Shelves held leather-bound books no one likely read. A sculpture of brushed steel sat on a low table beside orchids so perfect they looked rehearsed. Behind a desk of dark walnut sat Eleanor Price, majority owner of the St. James Hotel Group. Silver hair swept back, navy suit immaculate, eyes clear and unhurried. She was in her late 60s and carried the kind of calm only earned by surviving rooms full of men who thought they were permanent. "Miss Coleman," Eleanor said. "Please sit." Grace remained standing for one beat, then took the chair opposite the desk. Denise closed the door behind her and left. Eleanor folded her hands. "You created a memorable morning." Grace answered plainly. "That was not my intention." "Good. People who chase spectacle usually become it." A faint smile touched the older woman's mouth. "Tea?" "No, thank you." "Wise. The tea here is decorative." Grace almost laughed. Eleanor slid a slim folder across the desk. "I asked Human Resources for your file. Housekeeping temporary hire, 6 weeks employed, perfect attendance, no complaints. Before that, 3 years unaccounted for. Before that, internal audit associate at Mercer Hale Consulting. Before that, bachelor's degree in finance with honors." Grace looked at the folder but did not reach for it. "I did not realize my life was so brief on paper." "Lives often are," Eleanor said. "That is why character matters more than resumes." Rain drifted sideways against the glass. Far below, yellow cabs moved like sparks through wet streets. Eleanor leaned back slightly. "Why housekeeping? My mother needed care. Immediate income mattered more than titles." "And now?" Grace considered the question. "Now she is in memory care in Newark. Stable. Expensive. I work where the checks clear." Eleanor nodded once, not with pity but recognition. "Practicality is underrated." She tapped the folder. "Do you know how many executives sat in that boardroom this morning?" Enough to miss the obvious. The answer came before Grace could soften it. Eleanor's smile returned, wider this time. "Indeed." She rose and walked to the window, hands clasped behind her back. "Richard Whitmore has hosted deals here for years. He tips generously, speaks loudly, and mistakes both for virtue. Men like him believe buildings exist to echo them." She turned. Today, the building answered back. Grace said nothing. Some praise felt heavier than criticism. Eleanor returned to the desk. "Whitmore Capital has formally blamed the hotel for breach of confidentiality. I assumed they might. They are demanding your termination." Grace inhaled once, slow and quiet. "Then I suppose this meeting is efficient." Eleanor opened the folder again. "There is a second letter." She lifted a page. "Hanover Energy requests your contact information. Charles Bennett requests permission to interview you. 2 law firms asked whether you freelance. And my operations director would like to know who taught housekeeping to fold towels with military precision." Grace blinked. "My mother." "Of course." Eleanor placed the page down. "So no, Miss Coleman. This meeting is not about termination." The room grew very still. Grace felt the old instinct to distrust good news rise in her chest. Hard years teach suspicion faster than hope. "Then what is it about?" Eleanor slid a keycard across the desk. Black stripe, gold logo. Temporary reassignment. Effective immediately. Grace did not touch it. "To where?" "Internal risk review." Grace looked up sharply. Eleanor continued, as if discussing weather. "Every hotel contract, vendor agreement, lease renewal, event liability package, procurement bid, and acquisition memo crosses our desks. Apparently, we need better eyes." Grace let out the smallest breath. "I have not worked in finance in years." "You worked in finance this morning." "I was reading." "Exactly." Eleanor's tone sharpened by a degree. "Do not diminish your own skill because others ignored it." The words landed deeper than Grace expected. She thought of night shifts, folded sheets, aching feet, and the habit of shrinking herself to fit wages. "What if I fail?" she asked before she could stop herself. Eleanor answered immediately. "Then you will fail while being properly paid." Grace laughed then, a real laugh that surprised both of them. The room warmed. Eleanor pushed the keycard closer. "Salary begins at $92,000 annually, full benefits, flexible schedule for family care, probationary 90 days. Accept or decline now. I dislike prolonged theater." Grace stared at the card. Numbers she had not imagined hearing again moved through her mind like sunlight through blinds. Rent, medication, her mother's therapies, breathing room, dignity with receipts attached. "Why me?" she asked softly. Eleanor's gaze held steady. "Because competence should not need rescuing twice in one day." Grace reached forward and picked up the keycard. It felt cool, heavier than plastic should. At that exact moment, The office door opened without a knock. Richard Whitmore stepped in, face pale with restrained fury, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. He stopped when he saw Grace holding the card. Eleanor did not rise. "Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly, "you are interrupting." Richard's eyes moved from Grace to the desk. "I need a private word." Eleanor's voice became winter. "You had one this morning." She corrected it. Richard swallowed whatever he had brought with him. Then he looked at Grace and said, "This is not over." Grace stood slowly, keycard in hand, posture straight as the skyline behind her. "No, sir," she said. "It is just becoming visible." The air in Eleanor Price's office changed the moment Richard Whitmore heard Grace's answer. He stood in the doorway with rain still shining on his coat shoulders, jaw tight enough to sharpen the lines of his face. Men like Richard were accustomed to rooms adjusting themselves around their anger. This room did not move. Eleanor remained seated behind the walnut desk, one hand resting lightly beside a stack of contracts, as calm as if a courier had entered instead of a wounded executive. Grace stood near the chair with the black keycard in her hand, feeling its cool edge press into her palm like proof. Richard took 2 measured steps inside. "I asked for privacy," he said. "And I heard you the first time," Eleanor replied. "The answer remains no." Richard glanced at Grace, then back to Eleanor. "This employee interfered in a confidential transaction, damaged a client relationship, and exposed your hotel to liability." Grace almost smiled at the word employee. 30 minutes ago, he would have called her maid. Titles often improved once leverage changed hands. Eleanor folded her glasses and set them down. She exposed dishonesty. If that creates liability, the source is not her. Richard's nostrils flared slightly. "You are choosing theatrics over business." "No," Eleanor said. "I am choosing business over theatrics." Silence pressed against the windows while rain traced slow paths down the glass. Richard turned toward Grace fully now. "You think one lucky guess makes you important?" His tone was quiet, which made it meaner. Grace met his gaze without lifting her chin. "No, sir. I think facts remain facts whether I speak them or not." "Do not call me sir." "Then stop behaving like one expects obedience." The words landed before she could reconsider them. Richard's face hardened. Eleanor's eyes brightened with interest. Richard took another step, then seemed to remember where he was. "You have no idea who you embarrassed today." Grace answered softly. "I know exactly who embarrassed you today." For a second the room held only the sound of rain and the distant hum of elevators. Richard shifted tactics, as men often did when intimidation failed. His voice smoothed out, polished back into executive silk. "Miss Coleman, let us be realistic. You saw numbers out of context. Complex transactions require experience." Grace lifted the keycard slightly. "That must be why your numbers needed hiding." He ignored it. "You are being used. People like Bennett and Hanover love symbolic moments. They will praise you in daylight and forget you by dinner." The sentence carried enough truth to sting. Grace knew the world could applaud a story while ignoring the person inside it. But she also knew manipulation often wore the mask of wisdom. "Maybe," she said. "But even temporary respect lasts longer than permanent contempt." Eleanor gave a small approving nod. Richard's composure slipped another inch. "Do you know what happens when reputations are damaged? Jobs disappear. Contracts move elsewhere. Entire staff suffer because one person wanted attention." Grace thought of housekeepers changing sheets before sunrise, cooks standing 10 hours on tired knees, porters lifting luggage with polite smiles no one remembered. He was using workers as shields now, hoping guilt would do what authority could not. "They suffer more when leaders gamble with lies," she said. Richard looked at Eleanor. "You are allowing insubordination in your own office." "No," Eleanor said. "I am witnessing accountability in mine." Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced down, then quickly muted it. Another buzz followed seconds later. Then another. The screen lit repeatedly like distant lightning. Grace noticed the first real uncertainty pass through him. He stepped aside and answered in a clipped whisper near the window. "What now?" Pause. "Who leaked that?" Longer pause. "No, delay the statement." His shoulders tightened. "I said delay it." He ended the call and stood motionless for one breath too long. Eleanor did not ask. Powerful people hated questions most when they feared the answers. Richard slid the phone into his pocket. "This is not finished." "You said that already," Eleanor replied. It was unconvincing the first time. He ignored her. His eyes locked onto Grace. Hanover has paused one deal. I have 6 others in motion. Markets forget by Monday. Grace studied him carefully, then saw what had always driven him. Not greed exactly. Not prejudice alone. It was the belief that consequences were temporary for men like him and permanent for everyone else. Maybe markets do, she said. People remember how you treat them when you think they cannot matter. Something in his expression flickered then vanished. It was not remorse. It was recognition. He had underestimated the memory of witnesses. The phone buzzed again. This time Eleanor spoke first. You should answer that. It may be your board. Richard hesitated, then pulled it out. He listened for 3 silent seconds. Color drained from his face. I am on my way, he said, and disconnected. No one asked what happened. He straightened his cuffs, reclaimed what little dignity posture could still provide, and moved toward the door. There he stopped without turning. Enjoy your promotion, Miss Coleman. Rooms like this can be colder than hallways. Grace looked at the skyline beyond him, steel towers blurred by rain. Then I will bring my own warmth. Richard left. The door closed softly behind him, gentler than he deserved. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor rose and crossed to a side cabinet where crystal glasses sat untouched beside a pitcher of water. She poured one and handed it to Grace. You handled that well. Grace accepted it. Her hand trembled only now that the storm had passed. I almost did not. That is called courage, Eleanor said. Steady people are rarely calm before they act. They steady themselves while acting. Grace drank. The water was cold, clean, real. Outside, the rain had begun to lighten. Sun edged through the clouds in pale strips across the river. Eleanor returned to her desk and opened another folder. Now, she said, voice practical again. Before your first day officially begins, I would like you to review 3 vendor contracts and tell me which one is lying. Grace set down the glass, slid into the chair across from her, and for the first time in years, work felt like dignity instead of survival. By 6:15 that evening, the storm had moved east and left Manhattan polished. Sunlight spilled between towers in long amber bands, turning wet streets into ribbons of copper. On the 31st floor, most offices had gone quiet. Screens dimmed. Doors stood half open. The daytime language of urgency had drained from the building, replaced by softer sounds. A printer somewhere down the hall, distant elevator chimes, the whisper of ventilation through polished vents. Grace Coleman sat alone in a conference room smaller than the one where the morning had begun. 3 vendor contracts lay open before her, marked with sticky notes in neat rows. Beside them sat a legal pad filled with figures, arrows, and questions written in steady handwriting. Her housekeeping uniform was gone now, replaced by a charcoal cardigan Denise had found in lost and found storage, still carrying the faint scent of cedar. It was too large at the shoulders, but warm. Grace liked it immediately. She circled a clause on page 19 and leaned back. The room's glass wall reflected a woman she was still learning to recognize. Same face, same hands, same tiredness beneath the eyes. Yet something had shifted. Not in her. In the way the world had finally looked back. She stood and walked to the window. Far below, umbrellas moved along the sidewalks like dark petals. A food cart sent steam into cooling air. Yellow cabs flashed through intersections. People hurried home carrying groceries, flowers, briefcases, secrets. So many lives crossing within blocks of one another, each believing their struggle was private. Grace placed 2 fingers lightly against the glass. It was cool, solid, real. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. The screen read Maple Grove Memory Center. Her chest tightened for one reflexive second before she answered. Hello. Miss Coleman, this is Ruth at the front desk. Your mother is fine. Grace exhaled softly. Thank you for leading with that. Ruth laughed. I thought you would appreciate it. She had a very good afternoon. Ate all her dinner. Then insisted I call because she says her daughter got promoted today. Grace closed her eyes. She said that. With complete confidence. Grace smiled into the empty room. Did she remember my name? A pause. Not at first. But she remembered your voice after I described it. That small mercy nearly undid her. Can I speak with her? Of course. There was rustling, a distant television, then the soft static of movement. Finally came Laverne Coleman's voice, thinner than before the stroke, softer than before memory began loosening its threads. Baby, I am here, Mama. You eat today? Grace laughed through sudden tears. Yes, ma'am. Good. Smart girls forget lunch. I know. Silence followed, but not empty silence. The kind made of breath and effort and love trying to find the right door. Then Laverne spoke again. Did they see you? Grace turned toward the city lights beginning to bloom one by one. Morning replayed in flashes. The insult, the pages turning, Richard's face, Eleanor's offer, the black keycard in her hand. Yes, Mama, she whispered. They finally did. Took them long enough. Grace laughed fully then, one hand over her mouth. Yes, ma'am. Another pause. Wear good shoes tomorrow. Then the line shifted and Ruth gently returned. She is getting sleepy. Thank you, Ruth. She sounds proud. Grace looked down at the legal pad covered in numbers. She taught me to be ready. Then it sounds like she is proud of herself too. After the call ended, Grace remained by the window holding the silent phone. The room glowed with evening gold. Dust motes turned slowly in the light like tiny planets with nowhere urgent to be. She let herself cry for exactly 30 seconds. Not from pain, not even relief. From the strange weight of being seen after years of becoming invisible to survive. When the tears passed, she wiped her face, straightened the oversized cardigan, and returned to the table. She reviewed the first contract again. Hidden auto-renewal penalties. Predatory vendor lock-in. Sloppy indemnity language. She marked each issue cleanly. Work steadied her. Facts always had. At 6:42, there was a knock on the open glass door. Denise Mercer stepped in carrying 2 paper cups and a small white bakery bag. I guess you skipped lunch, she said. Grace looked at the bag. My mother said the same thing 5 minutes ago. Denise handed her a cup. Then I already trust your mother. They sat across from each other in companionable quiet. The coffee was hot and slightly bitter. The pastry was almond and still warm. I owe you an apology, Denise said after a moment. For earlier. For more than earlier, honestly. Grace tore a small piece of pastry. Accepted. Denise blinked. That easy. Life is expensive. I try not to spend extra on grudges. Denise laughed softly. You really are different. Grace shook her head. No. I am just tired of pretending smallness is professionalism. Denise absorbed that in silence. Outside, the sky deepened from amber to navy. Office lights across the avenue flickered on in grids. For what it is worth, Denise said, half the staff is talking about you like a folk hero. Grace groaned. Please stop them. Too late. Marcus from Dish Room claims he always knew you were undercover corporate. Grace smiled despite herself. Then Denise's phone buzzed. She glanced down and frowned. That is strange. What? Denise looked up slowly. Richard Whitmore just checked back into the penthouse suite. And he requested a private meeting with Eleanor at 7 sharp. Grace set down her cup. Why would he come back? Denise's expression tightened. Men who are losing usually come back for one of 2 reasons. To beg. Or to blame. The clock on the wall clicked to 6:45. In the hallway beyond the glass, footsteps moved quickly toward the executive wing. Grace looked at the marked contracts, then at the darkening city, then at the black keycard beside her notebook. The day, it seemed, was not finished yet. At 6:58, the executive hallway carried the kind of silence that only follows expensive trouble. Lights glowed warm behind frosted glass. The carpet muted every step. Beyond the windows, Manhattan had become a field of diamonds, office towers lit in grids against a deep blue sky. Grace Coleman stood outside the smaller conference room with her marked contracts gathered neatly in one arm. Denise Mercer had gone to check on staffing downstairs, leaving Grace alone with the sound of distant elevators and her own thoughts. Then Eleanor Price's assistant appeared from the far corridor. Miss Coleman, he said, slightly out of breath. Miss Price would like you present. Grace blinked once. For what purpose? She said you will know when you hear it. He opened the executive suite door and stepped aside. Inside, the room felt colder than before. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, posture exact, glasses low on her nose. Richard Whitmore stood near the window, coat removed now, tie loosened, one hand braced on the sill as if the skyline might steady him. 2 additional men occupied the side chairs. Grace recognized neither until one introduced himself. Martin Kessler, outside counsel for Whitmore Capital. The other offered only a nod and a leather folder. Auditor, Grace guessed. Richard turned when she entered. The confidence that had once moved ahead of him like weather was gone. In its place stood something narrower and more dangerous, desperation trying to look dignified. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said. "Please sit." Grace took a chair midway down the table. Richard remained standing. "I requested this meeting," he began, voice controlled but roughened at the edges, "because there has been a misunderstanding amplified by emotion." Eleanor did not look up from her notes. "Continue." The Hanover matter was recoverable until inaccurate assumptions spread through the room. He glanced toward Grace. Ms. Coleman interpreted draft materials she was not qualified to assess. Grace said nothing. Sometimes the fastest way to expose weakness was to let it keep speaking. Martin Kessler opened his folder. "However," he said carefully, "subsequent internal review has identified unrelated accounting irregularities that require context." Richard shot him a sharp look. "Not now." Martin did not retreat. "Now is precisely when boards prefer context." Eleanor finally raised her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, if you came to rewrite the morning, you are late. If you came to discuss the evening, proceed honestly." Richard's jaw worked once. He moved to the table and placed several documents down with more force than needed. "Someone inside my company has been altering reserve schedules for months. I trusted the wrong people." The auditor beside him slid one page toward Eleanor. "Preliminary findings indicate multiple transactions with concealed liabilities and deferred disclosures." Grace read the top line upside down. 3 prior acquisitions. Same structure. Same pattern. Richard saw her eyes move and understood she had already connected the shape of it. "You think this proves I am guilty," he said to her. "I think it proves this was not one mistake." The words landed flat and heavy. Eleanor leaned back. "Were you aware?" Richard answered too quickly. "No, did you benefit?" He hesitated 1 second too long. "Indirectly, as any chief executive would through company performance." "Then you benefited." No anger in her voice. Only arithmetic. Richard's shoulders dropped by an inch. It was the first honest movement Grace had seen from him all day. He looked older now, less sculpted by certainty, more human in the worst way. "You do not understand what it takes," he said quietly, not to Eleanor, but to the room itself. Quarterly pressure. Investors wanting miracles every 90 days. Banks tightening terms. Boards worshiping growth until growth gets messy. Grace studied him. For the first time she heard not arrogance, but confession disguised as explanation. "So you moved costs into the dark," she said. "I moved time," he snapped back. Then he heard himself. Silence followed. Even he seemed startled by the truth that had escaped. Eleanor removed her glasses and folded them carefully. "There it is." Richard stared at the tabletop. The city lights behind him reflected in the glass like scattered evidence. "I was going to unwind it after Hanover closed," he said, voice lower now. "1 clean quarter. 1 refinancing window. Then I could repair everything." Grace thought of all the workers whose pensions, jobs, and savings sat beneath phrases like 1 clean quarter. "And if no one noticed?" she asked. He looked at her then. Really looked for perhaps the first time all day. "People like you are not supposed to be in rooms where noticing matters." The honesty of it stunned even him. His face changed the moment he heard the sentence aloud. Shame entered through the doorway pride had guarded all day. Grace did not flinch. "People like me built most of the rooms." Martin Kessler closed his folder. "My advice is immediate voluntary resignation before the board meets tonight." Richard laughed once, hollow and tired. They already met. His phone buzzed on the table. He stared at the screen but did not touch it. "Chairman calling," he said. 3rd time. Eleanor's voice softened, though not by much. "Answer it." Richard picked up the phone with both hands, as if it were heavier than metal should be. He listened for less than 20 seconds. No one else heard the words. They did not need to. The color left his face. "Understood," he said. Then, after a pause, "Yes, effective immediately." He ended the call and remained still. "They removed me," he said to no one in particular. Outside, a helicopter crossed the skyline, red light blinking through darkness. Inside, only the air moved. Richard slowly lowered himself into a chair that had been empty all meeting. He looked smaller seated there. Less like a chief executive, more like a man who had mistaken momentum for permanence. His eyes drifted to Grace. "You cost me everything." She answered gently, almost sadly. "No, sir. I only arrived in time to watch it fall." Eleanor stood. Meeting concluded. Martin gathered papers. The auditor followed. Chairs slid back. Doors opened. Yet Richard did not move. As Grace rose to leave, he spoke once more, voice stripped of polish and threat alike. What do you do when the title is gone? Grace paused at the doorway, hand on the brass handle. Find out whether there was a person underneath it. Then she stepped into the hallway, where the night was waiting. By 8:10, the St. James Hotel had settled into its evening rhythm. Valets opened doors beneath awnings still wet from the afternoon storm. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the marble lobby. Soft piano drifted from the lounge, the kind of music expensive buildings used to convince people that calm could be purchased by the hour. Grace Coleman stood behind a temporary desk in the Internal Risk Review office, finishing notes on the 3 vendor contracts Eleanor had assigned her. Hidden fees, deceptive renewal triggers, insurance gaps. She wrote each issue in clean bullet points and slid the files into separate folders. Work had steadied her heartbeat all evening. Facts asked nothing except honesty. A light knock sounded on the open door. Denise Mercer stepped in, face unreadable. You have a visitor. Grace glanced at the clock. At this hour? Denise nodded. He insisted on waiting in the lower atrium instead of the lobby. Grace understood immediately. How long? 20 minutes. He declined water twice. Denise leaned against the frame. You do not have to go. Grace capped her pen. I know. She rose anyway. The lower atrium sat one level beneath the main lobby, a quieter space with stone planters, leather chairs, and a wall of glass overlooking the rain-dark street. At night, it felt almost like a chapel built for people who worship transactions. Richard Whitmore stood near the window with both hands in his coat pockets. No tie now. Collar open. Hair unsettled by weather or worry. Without the architecture of authority around him, he looked strangely ordinary. When Grace approached, he turned too quickly, as if afraid she might leave before he could speak. Thank you for coming. You asked for me. She remained standing. So did he. For a moment, neither seemed sure where to place their eyes. The city moved beyond the glass in blurred streaks of red and white. I was wrong this morning, Richard said at last. About many things. Grace waited. He swallowed. About you. About what mattered. About what I could keep hidden. The words sounded practiced, but the fatigue behind them was not. Why are you here? She asked. Richard looked down at his hands. Because every person I called tonight spoke to my lawyer first. He gave a humorless laugh. And because the only honest sentence I heard all day came from the woman I insulted before breakfast. Grace felt no triumph hearing that. Only the tired weight of how often pain was required before some people noticed truth. Richard paced once, then stopped. My board removed me. Banks froze lines of credit. 2 directors resigned publicly. By tomorrow, there will be cameras outside my townhouse. He looked up. I spent 30 years building a name. In 30 hours it may mean disgrace. Grace's voice stayed gentle. Names survive many things. Character survives fewer. He absorbed that quietly. I do not expect forgiveness, he said. Good, Grace replied. Because it is not owed on demand. He nodded once. Fair. A server passed through the atrium carrying glasses on a silver tray, then disappeared into the lounge. The faint clink of crystal faded. Richard glanced toward the sound, and something in his expression shifted. I never noticed them before, he said. The staff. The people moving everything. Most people notice service only when it stops. I know that now. Grace considered him carefully. Regret can imitate humility when it is frightened. She needed to know which one stood before her. Do you know why what you said this morning mattered? He answered quickly. Because it was rude. No, her tone remained calm. Because you believed it. You believed some people exist to serve rooms they are not worthy to speak in. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Yes, he said finally. I think part of me did. Honesty again, rawer this time. And now I think I was surrounded by talent I trained myself not to see. Grace let the silence sit between them. It was doing more work than either of them could. Richard reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small envelope. I brought this. She did not take it. What is it? A donation pledge to Maple Grove Memory Center. Grace's eyes narrowed. How do you know where my mother lives? Public records from your employment file, he said quickly. I should have asked first. That was wrong too. He lowered the envelope. It covers 2 years of care. No publicity. No conditions. Grace looked at the envelope, then at him. Is this guilt? Partly. Image repair? He thought. Perhaps a part of me wanted that too. I am trying to answer honestly. She respected the answer more than the offer. Then keep being honest. The money may help them, but it cannot purchase relief from me. Richard's shoulders eased in a strange way, as if boundaries were clearer than mercy. Understood. She took the envelope at last, weighing it in her hand. Heavy paper. Expensive stationery. Human motives rarely arrived pure. I will verify it before accepting anything. You should. He almost smiled. Grace moved to a nearby chair and sat. After a hesitant second, he sat across from her. They looked less like enemies now and more like two people stranded after different storms. What happens tomorrow? He asked. For you. For both of us. Grace considered. Tomorrow I review contracts at 9. Call my mother at noon. Learn software I should already know by 3. And me? You wake up without applause. He let out a breath that might have been laughter or grief. That sounds terrible. It might be useful. They sat quietly while traffic lights painted shifting colors across the floor. At length Richard said, If I asked how to begin again, what would you say? Grace thought of her mother polishing secondhand shoes, of textbooks rescued from trash, of years spent doing necessary work without witnesses. Do one thing each day that no one can monetize, she said. Help someone who cannot repay you. Learn a name you used to ignore. Listen when you are not the most important person in the room. Richard nodded slowly, as if memorizing instructions for a life he had never studied. He rose first. Thank you, Miss Coleman. Grace stood too. My name is Grace. He held her gaze, then gave the smallest bow of the head. Thank you, Grace. He turned toward the exit, stopped halfway, and looked back once more. For what it is worth, they should have seen you years ago. Grace slipped the envelope into her bag. For what it is worth, you should have seen everyone years ago. He accepted the strike of truth without defense, then walked into the night. Morning arrived clear and bright, as if the city had decided yesterday belonged to someone else. Sunlight poured across Manhattan in clean sheets, striking glass towers until they glowed pale gold. The sidewalks steamed gently where rainwater had gathered in seams of concrete overnight. Delivery trucks backed into alleys. Coffee carts hissed awake. People hurried forward with phones, umbrellas, ambitions, and unfinished thoughts. On the 31st floor of the St. James Hotel, Grace Coleman stepped out of the elevator wearing navy slacks, low black heels, and a cream blouse she had bought 3 years earlier for interviews that never became jobs. She had almost forgotten she owned it. The black keycard opened the office door with a soft click. Inside, the internal risk review suite smelled faintly of cedar shelves, printer paper, and fresh coffee. Her name was already printed on a small brass plate outside the glass wall. Grace Coleman. The sight of it stopped her for one full breath. Not because of vanity, because names placed where others can see them carry a different weight than names whispered to survive. She touched the edge of the plate with 2 fingers, then stepped inside. On the desk waited a new laptop, a stack of vendor files, and a handwritten note in blue ink. Welcome. Find what others miss. Eleanor. Grace smiled and placed her bag down carefully. Through the window, the river flashed silver between buildings. She sat, opened the first file, and began reading. By 9:20, she had already flagged 2 duplicate billing schemes and 1 insurance certificate that expired 6 months earlier. Facts still greeted her like old friends. At 10:15, Denise Mercer appeared carrying a small box tied with white string. From the pastry kitchen, she said. They are calling it a promotion muffin. Grace laughed. That is a terrible name. I agree. But it is. Blueberry. Denise noticed the brass plate outside and softened. Looks right there. Grace glanced toward it. I am still getting used to seeing it. Then keep looking. Denise left her with the box and the smell of warm sugar. At noon, Grace called Maple Grove Memory Center. Ruth answered on the second ring. She has already told 3 nurses that her daughter runs a skyscraper now. Grace laughed so hard she had to lower the phone. Please do not correct her. Would not dream of it. Laverne came on the line a minute later, voice brighter than the day before. Baby, were good shoes. Yes, ma'am. And did they give you a desk? Yes, ma'am. Then sit up straight at it. I am. Good. Furniture should know who is using it. Grace closed her eyes, smiling into tears that no longer embarrassed her. Yes, ma'am. After work, she rode the train to Newark carrying a bouquet of yellow daisies and the verified donation paperwork from Richard Whitmore. The pledge was real, unrestricted, and already processed. 2 years of care. She still did not know whether it came from remorse, fear, or some late-blooming conscience. Perhaps motives, like people, could be mixed and still useful. Maple Grove smelled of hand lotion, soup, and clean linen. Her mother sat by the window in a lavender sweater, watching sparrows hop through the courtyard hedge. "You are late," Laverne said the moment Grace entered. "I had meetings." "That means talking too long while saying little." Grace laughed and kissed her forehead. She placed the daisies in a plastic vase and set them on the sill. Sunlight lit the petals like tiny lamps. "Mama," she said gently, "someone donated enough to help with your care for a while." Laverne studied her daughter with eyes that sometimes forgot names but rarely forgot truth. "Then thank them by using it well." Grace nodded. "I will." They sat together in companionable silence. A nurse wheeled someone down the hall humming an old gospel tune. Somewhere a television audience applauded a joke no one in the room had heard. Outside, sparrows lifted as one and settled again. "Did they apologize?" Laverne asked suddenly. Grace knew exactly whom she meant. "One of them did." "Good." "It did not fix everything." "Apologies are not glue," her mother said. "They are brooms. They clean a path if you keep walking." Grace looked at her in wonder. Even memory loss had not stolen the architecture of wisdom. "You always know what to say." "No," Laverne replied. "I just say it before forgetting." They both laughed until tears came. When evening deepened, Grace walked back to Penn Station under a sky washed clear by yesterday's storm. She passed men in suits arguing into headsets, teenagers sharing fries on a bench, a woman helping an older stranger lift a grocery cart over a curb. The city remained what it had always been: hard, hurried, beautiful, indifferent, generous in flashes. At a crosswalk near 42nd Street, she noticed a familiar figure across the avenue. Richard Whitmore stood alone outside a modest coffee shop, coat off, sleeves rolled, holding 2 cardboard cups. Beside him sat an elderly doorman from a neighboring building on a folding stool, one ankle wrapped in a brace. Richard handed him a cup, then listened as the man spoke. No cameras, no entourage, no audience worth impressing. Just 2 people in evening light. Grace watched only a moment before the signal changed. She did not wave. He did not see her. Some redemptions grow best unwitnessed. She crossed with the crowd and kept moving. Later that night, back in her apartment, she placed her new office keycard beside the old housekeeping badge on the kitchen table. Plastic and metal, past and present, neither ashamed of the other. She opened the window. Cool air entered carrying distant sirens, laughter from the street, and the soft rustle of leaves from a tree stubborn enough to grow between buildings.